Good morning from California. Can you hear me okay, Yui?
Yes, perfect.
All right, I'm so happy to have you on my live stream, and thank you everyone for tuning in to the Nancy Chu High Vibe PM live stream channel. Today we have Yui Zhao here with us. She has written an extraordinary book called The Uncommon Executive Breakthrough to the C-Suite. Yui, tell us a little bit about yourself and what prompted you to write this book.
Sure, happy to. And thank you for having me on. So I'm Yui. I have a background in product. I worked at a startup called Thumbtack, was the first PM there, then spent a couple of years at Meta and Instagram, and then headed up product and engineering as chief product officer at Fuzzy Pet Health, which was a Series C startup. Throughout most of that time, I had been career coaching on the side. It started with people that were my direct reports or friends of friends or just in my network. And over time, it became a thing that I really loved nights and weekends. One thing I found while I was doing a lot of these career coaching sessions was that there wasn't a lot of resources out there for people looking to go from a senior manager director level into VP plus and the C suite. There was becoming a good amount of content, both written as well as within blogs and such, of like how do you become a PM or how do you enter into the workforce. I also particularly love Julie Zhou's book on making of a manager, of like what do you do as a first time manager. But as you got past that, there felt like to be a gap between, hey, I've got my team or maybe a couple of teams or people that I'm managing, but I want to be viewed as a leader, an executive within the organization that I'm in. And there just was not a lot out there, particularly for women and minorities, of
Hmm.
how do you make that leap from that middle management into an executive and a leader within the company. And so that's what prompted me to write my book. It's based on much of my own experience, as well as my coaching conversations, as well as conversations with other friends who've made that similar jump into the C suite or VP plus. And I want it to be a resource for people who feel stuck in their careers or just want to accelerate their careers, and bring more women and minorities into the C suite.
And when you were coaching on the side, you mentioned nights and weekends. What prompted you to actually take the actual action of writing this book versus just coaching your clients through it?
Yeah. Scale and the ability to scale. um, one-on-one coaching does not scale very well because my time doesn't scale that effectively. And I felt like I was addressing many of the same questions, across many of the people that I was coaching. Now, they were never the same because everybody has their own unique circumstance, right? Their particular company, their particular culture, their manager, their relationships with their team, where they wanted to go, what experience they have. So all of that is very unique. So each individual case was different, but there was a lot of similarities across them in terms, if you sort of bullet it up one level, right? In terms of the mindset that you have, the types of things you need to do, the types of relationships you need to develop. And I felt that that could be, the book could be a way for me to scale my time better and to give people a starting point to say, okay, like when I literally don't know where to go, right? And my manager or people in my management chain may not have the time, or interest in dedicating to my career growth. This is something that they can at least start with and say, like, okay, how could I apply some of these tips or advice to my own career and start doing something a bit differently than just working harder?
I also feel that, first of all, I love sitting down with people who have thought really hard and deep about human behavior and how to get the most of what you truly desire in life. And that's also another reason why I created my live stream is to learn from these individuals um, and to share the knowledge that they have already thought so deeply about. And for this particular topic, and for those of you who are watching right now, I have the QR code on the screen that will take you to Yui's book. For this particular topic, it is so close to home because as minorities and also as women, we don't have all the resources out there. We don't have all the support out there to help us achieve whatever it is that we want to achieve. Also, it starts with even us giving ourselves permission to even go there and to pursue the unknown. And that's why I feel this book is so special, because just by reading this book or just by going to read about this book is a sign and it's a step that you could take to give yourself that permission to even pursue this thing that you know might be waking up inside of you. And my most pressing question for you right now is, why is it so difficult for minorities to join the C-suite?
Oh, so many reasons. So many reasons. So I think one of the first one that I think many of the viewers and folks will know is that, well, the C-suite is dominated by white males. It still remains that 70 to 80%, depending on which metrics you're looking at, of the C-suite is white male. And so when you look at and think about who is in the C-suite, that is what you think of. And so as a minority and as a woman, you don't even think of it really as a possibility or a goal or something that you yourself could or should want to do. And even if you did, it could feel very intimidating, right? You may or may not have been in environments where you are the only, or, you are the token X, right? And, not everybody enjoys that. And in fact, many people don't. And it feels very uncomfortable. It could feel very uncomfortable. So that's a first. That plays out in terms of role models, right?
Right.
I've heard from multiple people actually, when they're like, okay, when I look for role models and I look for people in the C-suite like me, I don't actually want to be like them. And I only have like one example, and that's the best I could do. Or maybe I have two examples, right? And they're like, well, I actually, I don't want to end up like that person. And so, you may not have a spectrum of role models and ways of doing things and ways of being successful that inspire you to go do that. Now, let's assume that you got past both of those hurdles. You're like, I'm going to do this. I want to do this. I want to be in that room. Many of us, depending on the cultures that we come from, myself included, have values that are very different from what, let's just say, corporate America values
And what are
in
some of
terms
those
of
values?
leadership. Yeah. So, I was raised as a, Chinese immigrant, first generation, to be hardworking, very modest, very respectful,
Be humble.
be humble, to your point there, like the work will speak for itself, just put your head down and do great work, right?
And
And
that
that is
you will be seen if you just do that.
exactly, or you'll just be successful
Or maybe
somehow.
you don't want to be seen. How do
Yeah.
minorities feel about being seen?
Many of them find it intimidating, right? Because the most common scenario you see minorities singled out is usually in a negative context. It's rarely in a positive context.
What's a
Now,
negative context?
being, not to be super stereotypical, but like generally committing some kind of crime, generally speaking, doing something that's like against American values, or, stealing white corporate America's jobs. There's a lot of sort of underlying nuances in that could be really, really difficult. Being made fun of for our accents or how we look or how we dress, you're being singled out equals you're more likely to be bullied. And so I think there was a lot of truth to, I believe, the safety in a way that came with don't stand out,
Yes.
don't like, don't kind of go out there and be too unique, because that's just, you're going to get beaten down by the world and by society. But at the same time, leadership culture in America values speaking out, confidence,
Standing out.
creativity, unconventional ideas that all ran contrary to that. It's about, we very much admire in business leaders this ability to be different and be sort of unique, and be creative. And that is not values that were generally taught growing up. And that can be a huge barrier to people to, one, realize that, and two, be comfortable with embodying those values and feeling like that is a part of their true authentic self.
I think you hit the great point, which is this power dynamic that we have here, in the US at least. And I love what you said about this feeling of safety and security. We are taught to work really hard, right? We are taught to work really hard, be humble, and the work will speak for itself. We will be seen via our work, but not via our personality, not via who we are as who we are, and not via our values, for example. But all of those things make up your whole version of you that makes you unique. And I love that your book is an overview of the landscape that we're in, plus the tactical actions that we could take, or at least we could start thinking about how to take those actions. And one thing I love is you called out effective communication at scale. Tell us more about what you mean by this.
Sure. So when you're in middle management, the communication is still mostly somewhat manageable, I would say, in a more one-on-one basis, right? You probably have regular one-on-ones with your team. You probably meet regularly with your manager and maybe a few peers. And so the communication tends to be a bit more person to person, and maybe small group discussions. When you become an executive or a leader, you're communicating across hundreds, if not thousands of people, right? That's no longer sort of at the scale where one-on-ones could work at all. And so communication at scale means, how do you avoid playing telephone? That's how I think about it, right? We've all played telephone. We all know if that by the third or fourth person, whatever you have said is not what that fourth person has heard. And so, and that's very true with any type of corporate communication or communication at work as well, right? So if you rely on that type of communication, which actually executives do have to rely on to have the information propagate through their teams, you have to be very considerate about how you do that communication, such that when it does get to that fourth person who is, 3 levels away from you, how do you get the gist of that across, and how do you make sure that person doesn't hear something completely different from what you had intended to say? Which, by the way, has definitely happened to me before as a part of the learning process. So a couple of tips I like to give. One is just being visual, right? I think we've heard a lot of this in the past, but humans, our earliest form of communication across time and space were drawings on cave walls, right?
Mm-hmm.
Drawings work really, really well. And many of us remember images way more than we will remember paragraphs of words. In fact, for me personally, when I read things, I tend to store them in visual format in my brain so that I can remember things better and the spirit of things better. So to the extent possible, being visual, telling stories, help people connect the dots. We're much better at remembering a story that has a beginning, middle, and end than paragraphs of text that have bullet points in them. The second thing I like to say is, don't dictate specific actions. And so, as we first begin managing teams, or when we first begin to try to get groups of people to work together, we have this tendency to be pretty specific about what we're asking for. Like, hey, can you write this down? Can you do this document? Can you call this person? Can you talk to this? Can you do that? It tends to be very specific. Exact directions don't go well by the fourth person because, well, it'll get misinterpreted and parts of it will get forgotten. And so as a leader and as an executive, my recommendation is always focus on the strategy and the vision and the like, where are we going and why are we going there and what might there look like. Again, visual stories help here, but kind of avoid the like, and therefore we now have to do this specific thing. And therefore, you need to go do this specific thing. Now, there are definitely times where maybe you're working on a specific partnership, where you're working on a very specific, let's say, pricing model or revenue model where, yes, there are exact things that need to happen. But even then, it's how do we have a partnership with company X? Not, I need you to set up a meeting to talk to company X. Because at the end of the day, the meeting is an input to the output. And the output is you want additional revenue through a partnership. And so being sort of more directional with what you're asking will actually give teams the power and the autonomy to be able to define those specific actions and be creative about it in a way that you may not have thought of. And so that makes, again, the communication a lot more effective because you are essentially driving people towards the goal without giving them like nuanced, minute details of what exactly needs to happen.
Do we have to communicate differently at scale, that is, when we're communicating down versus across versus up?
Definitely. One of the things that people don't actually think about too much is how they do the communication and in what format and in what timing. So communication plans, as boring or perhaps silly as they sound, are actually really, really important. And the bigger the company you're at, the more important they become. Now, if you're at like a 10-person company, you probably don't need a communication plan as much. Just kind of think through it in your head, right?
What is the
So it's who you're going to talk to, right? Who are the stakeholders? What's the thing that you want them to understand, or what do you need from each of the stakeholders? And how are you going to do that? Is it an email? Is it a conversation? Is it, are you going to grab coffee with them? What's the best way? Do you go through someone else? Is it a group conversation? And to your point, like up, down, and sideways are different, right? When you're communicating up, you often want to be more succinct. You want to be more high level. You want to get the point across. And if there's an ask, it's got to be really clear. I need an ask and I want it by this time.
Right.
If you're communicating with your peers, you probably want to be a bit more casual. You may want to speak to them over coffee. You may want to be less directive and more, hey, I have an idea or a thought. Can I get your feedback? Can you help me with something? Can I help you with something? And then when you're communicating to your team, you kind of, I personally believe you don't want to be, again, authoritarian and be like, I need you to do X. You also still want to communicate the vision, but you need to be a bit more specific about, and here's how it influences each of your work, right?
Mm-hmm.
And here's how it impacts what you're doing now. And then again, giving them a sense of urgency. So, and then there's a question of like, what order are you going in? Are you going to your team first and then your peers and then up? Or are you going to your peers first and then to your team and then to your manager? All of these things, you can spend forever thinking about it, especially in larger corporations. I used to joke that when I was at Meta, I was just communicating. Like, that was it, like, over and over to many different teams. And that took up most of my time. But you got to think about how you're going to coordinate this entire thing such that the messages are received at the right time to form the right actions. And again, doing that at scale is a bit of an art rather than a science.
We have a comment from Thomas. This is really helpful. Thanks. I feel these tips should be used at all levels, not only when you're higher up.
I agree. Very much so. I think the main difference when you get more senior is that your peers become a more important group than when you're individual contributor in terms of influencing what they think and how they think. Now, again, it depends on what function you're in and how much you collaborate with your peers regularly. But for example, when I was the chief product officer, my team were the other C-level executives. again, yes, I had my team, as in like the other product managers and the product leaders, but my first team were the other C-suite executives. And it was important that we stay synced on everything first before even sometimes syncing with my own team, my product team.
Is there a difference between how the majority communicates versus how minorities communicate?
Is there or should there be? No.
Oh, yeah.
um, so there definitely is, and that comes from a lot of the implicit biases that minorities face. Being the minority, right? And so in generally speaking, this is true everywhere in the world. The majority sets the rules, and the minority kind of has to figure out which
Right.
rules and how to play those rules,
Right,
right?
right.
And much of what I'm saying again applies to business in the US. Like if I were in Asia, a lot of this probably doesn't make any sense because then we would be in the majority, and if you were a
Correct.
white male, you would be in the minority.
You're playing
Right?
a different game, yes.
Correct. And so I think that a lot of, again, the things that are valued, how communication happens is set up by the majority. And you see this contrast, right, going from the US to China, right? I worked in both places. And in the US, it's a lot of, you need to speak up if you have an idea. If you need to speak up to be heard, you need to advocate for yourself. You need to talk about things that you believe in. In China, I tried to get my teams to speak up and had a really difficult time to do that in a group setting. That's just not how that happens. And so, I think communication and methods of communication definitely vary depending on what the majority and, historical context, if you will, has set as this is how we work as a team.
That is very, very interesting. And it's a good segue to my next question, which is related to superpower. Because now that you've mentioned, if we are no longer the minority and if we are the majority, then the context is different, the environment is different, the cultural values would then become different, which would then need a different set of superpowers that you would need to thrive and grow in an environment that is different. And I'm going to go off script a little bit because I just remember a post you had shared probably when you first announced that you're working on this book. You did research on ChatGPT on advice that they would have, and you saw a really big difference between advice given to the majority versus advice given to minorities. Tell us more about what you learned from ChatGPT that really highlights the superpowers that we might need when we're minorities versus majority.
Yeah. So it's funny that you remember that post. I remember it as well, and it gave me more desire to write the book as data that hopefully will feed into the AI, the Gen AI models in the future. So what happened was, I was starting to write the book, and I got a couple of friends being like, can't you have GPT just write this for you? I mean, isn't the information already out there? Like, it's been talked about so much. Like, why don't you just have it write the book for you? I'm like, it probably can, but let me see what it can do and let me see what it would say. So I basically asked it, hey, imagine that I'm a director and I want to get promoted to the C-suite. What advice would you have for me? And the first prompt that I put in, I did not specify anything else. And the advice that ChatGPT gave was very focused on doing great work, advocating for your work, making sure that you're building relationships and making sure that there's a positive cycle where your great work is being recognized and then people are investing in you and so on. It's like, great. Okay, cool. Not specific enough, but I agree with the general sentiment. Out of pure curiosity, because I was starting to write a book for minorities, I edited the prompt to say, imagine that I am a woman, or imagine that I am African American or Asian American. And I asked the same question. If I am a director and I'm an Asian American woman, like, what advice would you have for me? And the answer completely changed. It changed to, well, you should learn to combat imposter syndrome. You should make sure that you dress appropriately. You should make sure that you join sort of the diversity and inclusion events and organizations. And I got kind of mad. I got mad, not kind of
What
mad. I
does
got,
dressing appropriately mean?
I have no idea.
Oh my God.
I'm sure we can go back, and I didn't ask it the follow-up question because I wasn't super curious. But it just surprised me that it went completely away from do the best work, get recognized, make sure you build relationships, to all these things that, yes, they do kind of matter, but I felt like they were tangential or in addition to, or somewhat, the 10% instead of the 80% of getting promoted, right? Because sure, you can dress amazingly and you can do a bunch of diversity efforts, but at the end of the day, your work needs to be amazing, right? And to not have mentioned it at all, I think was an entire miss. Again, I would have been okay if, the first 8 bullet points were the same and then they just added a few. Okay, taken. As a minority, you often have to do more work, and that's accepted. I was just I got very angry that it got replaced by these things that I was like, wait, that's not the primary focus. It may be things you have to do, but it's definitely not the primary focus.
And that is why you wrote the book. That's another.
That is why I wrote the book. Correct.
Most important reason why you needed to write your book.
Yes, correct.
And you mentioned that ChatGPT said, "Oh, you should manage your imposter syndrome." When the prompt was included minorities. You wrote about self-sabotage in your book. Tell us more about what you mean by this.
Yeah, so self-sabotage is something that I've seen women's and minorities and the folks that I've coached done, where they talk themselves out of engaging in a situation before they try. And it comes up in many different forms. So one way it comes up is that we have access to so much information, right? And many of us are very intelligent, research oriented. We want to know everything about everything we're going to do before we do it. So we go online and we start reading. We learn about every possible scenario. We learn about every fork in the road. We learn about every amazing person that's doing something similar. And then we're like, we can't do that. Like, that sounds way too hard, and you just start talking yourself, and they make a long list of things that they need to do before they go for that promotion, or, all the things that could go wrong and all the different scenarios, and the list get longer and longer and longer. And the higher up you go in the corporate ladder, the longer the list goes. And the more impressive your peers are, and the more accomplished your peers are, and the people that you're potentially competing with for a particular role. And so it feels so daunting that they're just like, yeah, no, I don't think I'm qualified, or I don't think I can do this. I'm just not even going to try. Right. And they sort of just talk themselves out of it without even trying or attempting for it. What I often see now also with social media and things like LinkedIn or Instagram and many others is that you see the qualifications that other people have in aggregate. And in your mind, you start putting them together as if they were one person. And you always pick the best. You always pick the good things about the other people, not the things that you have that they don't have. But you're always going to pick, like, Nancy has this, my other friend has this, my other friend has this. And they're all, oh my gosh, doing the same thing that I want to do. And so you create this magical person that in aggregate is much more qualified than you are. But guess what? That person doesn't exist.
Right.
And guess what? That person, if they did exist, may or may not be competing for the same job, right? And so, it's another way that we kind of self-sabotage, and we give up, and we forget that everybody has their, things that work really well, and what they're really great at, and what their weaknesses or they may be, and you're also one of them. Somebody could be looking at you saying the same thing, being like, oh my gosh, like, Nancy is this, or Yui is that. And so I often encourage people to try, right? Like, before you talk yourself out of a situation, sometimes it's actually kind of nice to put on some blinders and go, I'm just going to give this a shot because I really want to make this happen. I may or may not think I'm the most qualified person. There may or may not be amazing people a couple years down the line from me of what I'm doing. But here's why this problem isn't solved, and here's why I am passionate about doing this particular thing. And I think it's important to just get started.
How does the majority tackle imposter syndrome versus a minority?
Yeah. I think that as a it's more of a mindset. So I wouldn't say that if you're in the majority, that means you don't have imposter syndrome. You most likely still do.
Yes.
And most likely, that's still applicable. But I think as a minority, you're more often told that you're not qualified.
Right.
Whether that's true or not, you
Right.
just hear that narrative a bit more. And so you're more likely to have imposter syndrome. One, because you don't look like the majority. So you don't look like that guy at the top who's the CEO or in the C-suite today. So, you're going to have that feeling. But two, you're also told by the world a bit more that you're not like us. You're not like the rest of us or the majority. And so imposter syndrome is really based on the premise that, like, if we feel underqualified, it is because you're underqualified, which is a completely untrue statement and something everybody should just throw out the door. But it's a natural feeling. You feel when you try something new that you haven't done before that may or may not be quote unquote challenging, you feel uncomfortable, you feel anxious, and you're like, hey, can I do this really, really well? But it actually has nothing to do with whether you're able to do it well.
Right.
It's just a very natural emotion that we have that tends to hold people back, especially as we get older, right? I have 2 toddlers. I never see them have imposter syndrome about anything. They're very much like, hey, I'm just going to try this thing. And then if it doesn't work, maybe I'll try it a different way, for better or worse. And so they don't feel like they're underqualified to jump off something or to try to bake a cake. They just try it, right? And I think as we get older, because we hear from others and from society and culture, you're good, you're not good enough, or you're not qualified, you start thinking that within your own head, and that prevents you from taking that action or going for that next step.
I was listening to a podcast this morning. It was Jamie Kern Lima, who was the founder of IT Cosmetics, which is a cosmetics brand, who then sold her company to L'Oreal for more than $1 billion and became, I think, the first female CEO for L'Oreal. She told this story that completely shocked me because I use IT Cosmetics and I love that brand. I love their products. And she was saying that a few years before all the success that you see on the surface, she was seeking investment for her business. And the investor told her that he was not going to invest in her company. And she asked for feedback. And he said, I just don't believe that women will buy cosmetics from someone who looks like you.
Hmm.
That really triggered like everything. It's just really triggering on so many levels for women, for minorities that look differently. And that is a representation of the difficulties that we might face. And from my perspective, yes, everyone has imposter syndrome. It doesn't matter if you're a minority or the majority. But when you're in the majority, you kind of have this playbook because you
Mm-hmm.
kind of see success in someone who kind of looks like you or someone who has similar background as you. And so it's the goal then becomes less daunting versus when you're in the minority because you don't have a playbook, right? You don't have a role model, like you mentioned. And so every step that you take just feels really raw, feels really new. But what I took away from the podcast earlier today was she said and she was told that she was crazy by her peers, by her support, quote unquote, support system, by her family, for wanting to do this thing that no one else has really done before from someone that looks like her or someone who's from her background. And she had to go to therapy for many years to deal with this trauma of being called that she's crazy. And she was able to reframe to, you're not crazy, you're just the first.
Mm-hmm.
That reframing is really powerful, and it's very relatable to what we're talking about here, which is self sabotage. There is a way to reframe from something that might not be helpful to something that could actually give you the drive and the support and the motivation to just take one step toward whatever it is that you want, which is what I was saying earlier. Just by looking at Yui's Amazon page, for example, taking a step, and you might take another step, which is ordering the book, and you might take another step, which is reading the book. It's just about taking one step at a time, and it doesn't have to
Yeah.
be daunting. It doesn't have to be scary either.
No, and it's an interesting example you bring up because she took being labeled or called as crazy in a very negative way.
Yeah.
I honestly think all entrepreneurs are crazy, right? Like, because in a way, the definition of crazy is doing something that no one has done before in a very low probability of success environment and still doing it anyways. There's a very thin line between like good crazy and bad crazy. And in a way, like for minorities, we all kind of have to be a little crazy. We all kind of have to be okay with going down a path, taking an action that you may or may not have seen someone else do before. And you may or may not see someone who, has laid out that exact path that you want to take, that you can just follow. Now, if you want to be a leader, the definition of that is sort of going down paths that others haven't taken. But it definitely helps when you have others who've done things similar or others who are there really behind you. You mentioned she did not have a support system. Again, part of the reason I'm writing the book and, have now invested more time into career coaching is I want to be that support system for others, in a way that I think only as an Asian woman, only I can be, or people like me can be. And so I think it is important to, again, find that community, even if the thing that you've done hasn't been done before. It's still possible to find the community who will believe that you can make that happen,
Yes.
even if they themselves also haven't done it before.
I love that. Yeah, I feel the power of a community is so important, and I'm really grateful that you're putting yourself out there like this at this level. You've never written a book before, right? And there hasn't been a book on this topic, and now you're making it available. Now you're putting yourself out there. I'm just really thankful that you're doing this for all of us.
You're very welcome. I'm very glad it's out there. I hope that many more people find it a useful guide and something that, they get a tidbit out of and feel more like, hey, there's someone else who either went through something similar or can unblock me again from where I am right now, and show me that there can be a way and it can be done.
Tell us about how you developed your executive mindset as minority. And you're calling yourself double minority also.
I am.
Yeah.
How did I develop? Well, so I guess let's first talk about what is an executive mindset, right? And so an executive mindset is really, how do executives think? How do they, when they look at a problem, what are the things that come first and foremost? And what are the things that they often do a little bit differently from if you're a middle manager or if you're just starting out in your career? The first that struck me was just putting the company first at all times. Now, when you're coming up through the ranks, there are often people who succeed by doing better than their peers, right? And they do it in a way that may or may not benefit their peers. They're just really, really amazing at what they do, and potentially at the cost of what happens with other people who are quote unquote competing with them as they kind of go up in the organization. That no longer works at the executive level because the company needs to go first. So the size of your team, the size of your budget, even your own career progression does not come first. What is best for the company has to come first. And if it doesn't, it results in a very dysfunctional leadership team where everybody is trying to, do what's best for themselves and the company itself doesn't move forward.
Mhm.
And so what I encourage many people do is that when you start to collaborate a lot more with other teams in other functions or in other product lines or in other groups, think about how you can come up with ways that puts the company's success first rather than your team's success first.
Mm.
And yes, there will be things where both of those statements are true. It's good for you, it's good for the company. But there will also be times where it's good for the company, or maybe it's even good for your peer, but it's not so good for your team, or it doesn't matter to your team.
What does that mean? That we should still do the work, or
Yeah, we should. Well, it depends. It depends on the situation, but I would at least give it consideration in that my argument is always if it is the best thing for the company that you could be doing, then you should do it. Like, no question. If it's more important than all the other things you have on your list, but it doesn't necessarily benefit your team,
right?
you should do it. It becomes a little bit harder when it's not necessarily the best thing for your team and it's not necessarily the best thing for the company. But it is still better for the company than your team. And that becomes a conversation that you may not be the end decision maker of, but you can at least frame and present. And in just framing and presenting it that way to your VP or senior VP or, executive, they're going to be like, wow, Yui is thinking about the company first. And she has this question of like, should she put the company or whatever this project is above her own team's goals? Just by raising that question, even if you don't like have the answer, that's already a great step in being viewed as a leader.
Is this saying that your team is not doing this yet and no one else is also doing this? And that as an executive team, we should think about this thing because it's beneficial for the company?
It doesn't have to be. So let me give you like a very tangible example. So from product, since that's kind of my background, as a product manager, you often have to prioritize your roadmap, right? And you have a set of, let's just call it features that you want to work on for the quarter that, moves some metric that you need to move. Let's say a peer team of yours comes and says like, hey, I need your help because you have these people on your team or you have these things to work on this other project and this other feature. And here's why you should work on it. You're like, wait, no, I have my goals, my resources. Why should I work on this other thing that you want me to help with?
Right.
This is where that conversation comes in, right?
Right.
That other thing that your peer wants you to work on, at the end of the day, is that more important for the company or not, right? And do you sacrifice potentially not working towards your own goals to do something that moves someone else's goals that in the end, let's say, may drive revenue more than whatever it is that you were trying to do? And it can be very, very scary for people to be like, wait, I'm going to increase my chance of missing my like goal for the quarter in order to do this other thing that helps somebody else. That's like not a thing that's immediately under my purview. Like, wow, that's like really, that's a very different way of looking at it. But in many of those scenarios, it is actually to be viewed as a leader. Again, you have to talk about it, which we can talk about more, but to be viewed as a leader in the company, that thought process is exactly what an executive would be thinking about, right? Like they would much rather the other project happen, let's say if it's better impact, than what you're working on. And you thinking that way helps them realize, oh, like there's a lot of potential here in how Yui or is thinking about this particular problem.
Tell us more about career coaching and how it supports self-advocacy, address imposter syndrome, and the other superpowers that we would need to cultivate to break through to the C-suite.
Yeah. So I had an amazing career coach when I was leaving Thumbtack. Actually, I've had two amazing career coaches who've helped me in very critical periods in my career. And what they usually really do is like they're in your corner. And I've had amazing managers. I have so many managers that are in the acknowledgments of my book. I absolutely love them. And they almost always cared so much about my career growth. So I've been very lucky in that aspect as well. But there's still a difference between they are managing the business and the company as well as your career,
Yeah.
versus somebody who is just purely like cares about your career and that's
Right.
it. Like
Yeah.
that's all they're there to do,
They
right?
work for you.
And they work for you. Yeah,
Yeah.
they're there to support you. They're there to show you different options. I particularly love that my career coach had seen other careers like mine, but 5-10 years in the future, and can say like, this is what it could look like, and help me think about things in a way that I was not thinking about them, both in terms of the value that I had delivered, what I had done, as well as like what was possible. She was telling me these things like, you could try doing this. And I'm like, no, I can't. Like, like, no way. She's like, have you thought about doing that? I'm like, no, I thought you had to be, blah, blah, blah. And I come up with some excuse. But she'd be like, no, like, think about why can't you do it? Like,
Mhm.
why can't you do these things? Why can't you ask for these things? Exceptional people ask for exceptional things, and there was just ways of changing how you were thinking about your little world and broadening it and showing you perspectives of what could be possible. That was so valuable. And then they're also there to help you practice if you like to practice, for example, self-advocacy or a speech or a conversation, someone to run through that with you and to say like, okay, given your scenario, given what I know, here's the type of feedback you might get. Here's how you might think about that communication challenge and that communication plan. And they also keep you accountable. They say like, hey, you said you wanted this. You said you were going to do this. Are you still going to do it? I remember there were many times where I would avoid doing this thing, like speaking at all hands. And my career coach would keep asking me, have you spoken at an all hands? I'm like, and the next time I meet with her, I'm like, crap, like I haven't spoken at an all hands yet,
Yeah.
And so they keep you very much like, you're like, I know I need to go speak at an all hands, but I really don't want to, And so
Right.
they keep you very honest, and then they bring that little bit of guilt of like, okay, let's keep you on track, let's make sure that you're moving towards what you want, and they
Right.
constantly check in and make sure that that is still what you want to do. And there just honestly isn't another sort of person out there that would do that.
We have audience. We have Priyanka in the audience asking, what makes an amazing career coach? How do you go about assessing them?
That's a great question. I have my personal perspective, so I'll give you mine, which is one, the people that they've worked with in the past. So one of the great questions that I encourage everybody to ask career coaches they want to work with is like, can they share what types of people they've worked in the past? They may not be able to give you specific names because they
Yeah.
cannot, and the clients don't want to, but what types of people, what have they helped them do? What are the situations they've helped them address? And think about whether those are similar to the things that you want done, and that you're, looking for support with. The second thing is just your ability to get along with the coach. Like, ask them hard questions. Like, if they give you a free intro for 20 minutes, ask them the hardest questions you have. Don't give them any like softballs. Ask them the trickiest things that are top of mind, or the weirdest thing that you're like, I'm just struggling with this. Like, what should I do? Just put it out there and see what they say and see what they can say. And whether you like their way, their thought process and their way of thinking through what it is can help, and what it is that will help you move forward. And then the last thing I say is, I personally prefer to work with coaches who either have a ton of experience coaching people with similar backgrounds to me, or are 5-10 years ahead, or have actually been in that job themselves. I think it's very difficult to replace some of that of just like, you've been through it, you've been in it, exactly what it's like. And I think either that, or having coached lots of people who've been in that scenario, that they basically kind of understand like, okay, in your scenario, this is generally how your world
Right.
works, and can really speak to that.
They live it and they breathe it, basically.
Yeah.
I just recently shared an analogy to finding a coach and being coached. So growing up Asian, like a lot of Asian kids, I played the piano.
I did too.
Thing that Asian kids do. So I played a piano, and I was one of the few people to actually go on and be really serious about it. I became competitive in piano, and the highlight of my career, my piano career, was senior year in high school. I soloed with Honolulu Symphony, and I kind of see that as kind of like being a VP in a career. It's the highlight, and it's something that I was working toward. And I was coached to go on this journey. I wasn't just learning how to play the instrument in terms of the technicalities of how to actually play, but to also learn how to compete and how to perform, which is very different from just learning the technicalities of how to play an instrument. And to actually perform on stage with the symphony, I needed to audition, which was 1 year before the performance. And to actually get ready for the audition, I needed to practice auditioning by actually going through the audition the year before the actual audition. And to get on stage to just practice auditioning, I needed to practice getting on stage and just normalizing the fears associated with being on stage. And that was through the coaching and the opportunity and the accountability of performing every month since I was in elementary school. And performing every month, whether it's for the retirement home or for our piano studio or for the parents and the community and Christmas recitals, whatnot, it was happening every month since I was in elementary school and middle school, such that when I was a freshman in high school, actually auditioning became really, it was normalized. And so physically, I'm only 5 feet tall. And when I was in high school, I was only 80 pounds. I was this really petite Asian girl. And to actually be on stage in a way that, so you have to stand out because there's other people on stage. And to stand out, my teacher, who was really my coach, designed this experience for me to showcase my ability and my technicalities that was very loud for a little girl to play. And you can imagine a little girl on stage next to a grand piano. It's this tiny person next to this huge instrument. And he told me that I should put my hair up in a ponytail. That was something that I would never have figured out on my own. And the reason why he said that was because you want to demonstrate the movement, you want to demonstrate that you could produce this loud piece of music, and your hair, when it's moving, it adds to the show. And for me, coaching is a nice to have. You don't need to be coached unless you really want to invest and get this thing that you want. For me, maybe there's a possibility that I could figure out how to play the piano on my own. But if I was not coached, I would not have the accountability to actually normalize all the jitters associated with just being on stage and designing the showmanship of putting on a show. And that's analogous to what we actually have to do at work. Every presentation is a show. Every hallway conversation that you have with stakeholders or the executive team, it's a show. It's a lot more than just, okay, I know how to be a PM, right? That's the technicality of being a PM. But there's a whole other thing that we have to do to stand out, and that's where a coach can really help.
I love the story.
Oh, thank you so much. We have one last question from the audience, from Thomas. Going back to your all hands speech, what made you finally speak at all hands?
I signed up.
Action. You took the
I took a very small action, which is I reached out to the person who coordinates our all hands and I sent her an email. It wasn't even in person. We were in the office, but I was like, I'm just going to send her an email Friday afternoon with enough time before my next coaching session to actually do the all hands. And then I'm just going to close my computer and like see what happens. So I sent her an email being like, hey, I have this topic. Would love to present at the next all hands, which was the following Friday. And then I closed my computer and went on to my weekend. So that was my tiny little step forward. And then I sort of let the rest of it play out, right? She would write back and say like, hey, great topic. Here's your time. Here's when you would go. And then I would have to practice, to your point, and I would have to find a room to practice in and do all of that. But it is really just breaking it down to like that first small step that you have to take. Makes it much easier than let me imagine myself speaking in front of hundreds of people, because that end is very intimidating if that's where you start.
I love that. Tell us about your newsletter. What do you write about?
Sure. So I just recently started a newsletter. It's called The Uncommon Executive, very much as a note to the book, on Substack. So it's yuizhao.substack.com.
And
And
here on the screen if you're watching.
Perfect. And I talk about, career coaching. I talk about breaking through to the C-suite. I'm also a venture partner with LifeX Venture. So I talk a little bit about investing and being on the investing side. And then I will also share about product experiences, and we'll see how much I intersperse in there, but I'm aiming for like 80% of the content to be career coaching related, and the rest coming from my background in product and venture, a mom of 2 boys. And yeah, we'll see where it goes from there.
I am so excited about this book, and I really enjoy this conversation. For those you might be dialing in later, feel free to reach out to Yui and ask her all the questions you have about breaking through to the C-suite. All right. Thank you so much for coming to the live stream, and let's stay connected.
Thanks for having me. You guys know where to find me. All right.
Bye.
Bye.